Set. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story that spans 5,000 years. Wherever you are right now, driving through empty roads under a winter moon, lying in the dark, listening to rain, sitting alone in a quiet room, take a moment, feel the stillness around you, because what follows isn't simply a collection of old tales. It's something deeper. A pattern that appears in every culture, every century, every culture of human civilization. The story of the creature that walks on two legs, but runs on four, the human who becomes beast, the werewolf. This will be the most comprehensive investigation of werewolf history ever created. Not a summary, not a highlight reel of famous cases, but a complete examination. We'll walk through Greece, where the first transformation was recorded in writing. Stand in Viking long houses where warriors wore wool felts into battle. Enter medieval courtrooms, where accused werewolves faced execution. Cross the fields of 18th century France, where something wolf set. Hybrid, or unknown creature, killed over 100 people. And finally, step into Victorian asylums, where doctors encountered patients who genuinely believed their bodies were changing. Before we begin, a request. If you value research over repetition, substance over speculation, history over Hollywood invention, then subscribe. This content exists because you support it. Turn on notifications and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. The forests of Scandinavia, the villages of France, the cities of England, somewhere else entirely. Every culture has told this story. Let me know which version you grew up hearing. Now, settle in. Find your most comfortable position. Every minute will teach you something new. From ancient ritual to medieval panic to modern psychology, from myth to trial to medicine, the complete history, the verified history, the only history that matters. We begin not with a monster, but with a king. Chapter 1. Lan, the first werewolf set. Ancient Greece. 3000 BCE. Mount Leon rises from the Arcadian wilderness in southern Greece. 3,000 years ago, this peak was sacred to Zeus in his most ancient, most primal aspect. Zeus likes chaos. Zeus, the wolf god, the summit was forbidden. Ancient sources tell us that anyone who entered the sacred precinct would die within the year, not from divine punishment, but from something else, something the Greeks only whispered about. Our earliest written account comes from Panias, a Greek geographer writing around 175 CE, but he documented traditions already ancient in his own time. He wrote, "On the summit of Mount Lyn is an altar to Zeus Laios. I hesitated to inquire about the details of the sacrifice made there. Let them be as they are, and have been from the beginning." Panias refused to describe what happened on that mountain, but other sources were less cautious. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, mentioned Arcadian legends that at Zeus's altar on Lion, human flesh was mixed, set, with animal flesh in ritual offerings. Anyone who consumed the human portion would transform, not literally. The Greeks weren't describing physical shape-shifting, they meant a transformation of the soul, a boundary crossed, a change so profound that the person could never return to what they were before. The Greek word is lepo, to make into a wolf, to become wolf-like, not in body but in nature. This brings us to the myth that gave the mountain, and eventually the medical term, lyanthropy, its name. The story of King Lion. Multiple ancient sources preserve this tale with variations. The earliest detailed version comes from Iod's Metamorphoses, written around 8 CE. But Od was drawing on Greek traditions centuries older. He tells us that Lycaon was king of Arcadia, a powerful ruler who grew arrogant. When Zeus visited his court, disguised as a traveler, Lycaon decided to test whether this stranger was truly divine. He served Zeus a meal, but Leon had done something unspeakable. He had killed a hostage, a man under his protection, and mixed a flesh into the food. Zeus recognized the atrocity immediately. Lightning struck the palace. Leon fled into the wilderness, and there the transformation occurred. Weed writes, "His clothes changed to shaggy hair, his arms to legs. He was a wolf, yet kept some human traces. The same grey hair, the same fierce face, the same glittering eyes, the same savage image, but read that description carefully, kept some human traces." The Greeks weren't describing a man who became a wolf. They were describing a man who acted like a beast, while retaining enough humanity to understand what he'd become. The punishment wasn't the wolf body. The punishment was the awareness, knowing you've fallen so far that even your own form reflects your nature. This is crucial. The werewolf myth begins not with horror, but with hubris. not with a curse inflicted randomly, but with a boundary deliberately crossed. Leon tested a god. He violated the most sacred Greek set concept. Xenia, the hospitality owed to travelers. He murdered a guest and served human flesh. The transformation was consequence, not coincidence. You act like a beast, you become one. The Greeks told this story for over 1,000 years. It appears in Apollodorus's library, written in the 2nd N century CE, which adds that Leon tried to sacrifice a child on Zeus's altar. It's referenced by Pausanias, by Ply the Elder, by multiple sources across centuries. Each telling reinforces the same lesson. Civilization is fragile. The boundary between human and beast is maintained through behavior, not biology. Now, here's what we know from modern archaeology versus ancient legend. In 2016, a Greek-American archaeological team from the University of Pennsylvania excavated the altar site on Mount Lean's summit. They found evidence of continuous ritual activity from approximately 3000 B.C. through the Roman period. They discovered burnt animal bones, cattle, goats, sheep. They found luxury items offered as dedications. And they found something else. The skeleton of a teenage male, approximately 13 to 16 years old, dated to approximately 1100 BCE. The bones were placed in an east-west orientation in a bed of ash directly on the altar's southern slope. No other human remains have been found at the site. The archaeologists were extremely careful in their interpretation. Dr. David Gilman Romano, who led the excavation, stated, "Whether this is a sacrificial victim or not, we don't know. It may be, but we need to be very careful about making that assumption. What we can verify rituals occurred on Mount Linen for over 3,000 years. The Greeks associated the site with Zeus in his wolf aspect. Legends of transformation and mysterious practices surrounded the location. One adolescent was buried in the ritual precinct in circumstances unlike any other burial in the region. What we cannot verify that human sacrifice actually occurred, that consumption of human flesh was part of any ritual that anyone ever physically transformed into a wolf. The power of the lion story isn't whether the rituals were real. It's that the Greeks created and preserved for millennia a myth about crossing boundaries, about what happens when you violate the rules that make us human. The werewolf entered human imagination not as a monster from outside, but as a warning about what we contain within. From Greece, the concept spread, but it took very different forms in different cultures. In the frozen north among the Vikings and Norse peoples, the wolf was not a punishment, it was power. Chapter 2, Owner, Wolf, Warriors of the No Rest. In the year 793 CE, Viking raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the attack with horror. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain. The heathens poured out the blood of saints, laid waste the house of our hope, trampled the bodies of saints in the temple of God. What terrified the monks wasn't just the violence. It was the warriors themselves. Men who fought with an intensity that seemed inhuman. Men who wore wolf pelts over their armor. Men the Norse called wolf coats, the wolf warriors. To understand the Alpha, we must understand how fundamentally different the Norse viewed wolves compared to the Greeks. In Greek mythology, Zeus transformed Leon into a wolf as punishment. In Norse mythology, Odin, the Alatha, king of the gods, owned two wolves, Gary and Freki, whose names mean the greedy one and the ravenous one. These wolves sat beside Odin's throne in Valhalla. Odin fed them all his food, consuming only wine himself. The wolves were not evil, they were sacred companions to the highest god. The Ulfner took their inspiration from this association. They believed that by wearing wolf pelts, by entering a trance-like state before battle, they could channel something of the wolf's nature, not transform physically. Let's be clear about this, but access a psychological state. That gave them combat advantages. Our sources for the Ulfidena come from multiple Icelandic sagas written in the 13th and 14th centuries, but describing events from the Viking Age 2 to 3 centuries earlier. The most detailed account appears in the Ingilinga saga, part of Snorri Estlia's hymn, Siala, written around 1225 CE. Snorri describes Odin's warriors. His men went without shields, were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, were as strong as bears or bulls. They killed people with a single blow. Neither fire nor iron affected them. This is called going berserk. Wait, that says berserk, not wolf coat. Here's a crucial distinction modern popular culture often misses. The Norse had two types of warrior cults. Berserkers wore bear pelts, Ulfter wore wolf pelts. They were related but distinct traditions. Both entered altered states before combat. Both were associated with Odin, but the wolf warriors had their own specific characteristics. The Vatins da saga, written in the 13th century, describes a warrior named Thorir, who was called Ulfadin. He wore a wolf skin into battle, and because of this, he was called by that name. The Volunga saga, likely composed in the 13th century, but drawing on much older, oral traditions, contains the most detailed wolf warrior episode in Norse literature. The heroes Sigurd and his son Sinfoti discover wolf pelts hanging in a house deep in the forest. When they put them on, they cannot remove them. For 10 days, they run through the wilderness, understanding the speech of wolves, hunting like wolves, killing like wolves, killing like wolves. They can only resume human form every 10th day. When the period ends, they burn the wolf skins and swear never to wear them again. This is not literal transformation. The saga makes clear the pelts are physical objects they wear and later burn. But something profound happens to their minds while wearing them. They act on instinct. They kill without restraint. They lose the ability to control themselves. When they return to human form, Sigmund tells his son, "Those pelts were full of evil. Let us not suffer from them anymore." What was actually happening with the historical? Modern scholars offer several theories. Some suggest the trance state was induced through hyperventilation, rhythmic chanting, and psychological preparation. Others point to possible use of psychoactive substances. Though evidence for this is limited, the most likely explanation is a combination of cultural belief, intense psychological conditioning, and the physiological effects of preparing for mortal combat. Consider what we know about the human body under extreme stress. Adrenaline floods the system. Pain tolerance increases dramatically. Time perception alters. Peripheral vision narrows to tunnel focus. Strength increases as the body accesses. Reserves normally held back by the brain's safety limiters. Modern soldiers experience these effects in combat. The Ulfner weren't experiencing anything supernatural. They were experiencing the human body's emergency protocols. What made them unusual was that they deliberately trained to enter this state. Archaeological evidence for wolf warriors is limited but suggestive. Multiple Viking Age graves have been discovered containing wolf bones placed deliberately with the deceased. Some burials show warriors interred with wolf pelts. Belt buckles and jewelry featuring wolf imagery appear throughout Scandinavia from this period. The wolves are not depicted as monstrous, but as powerful as companions to warriors. But there's a darker side to the Ulfedno tradition, one rarely mentioned in modern retellings. The Engula saga passage I quoted earlier continues. When the bear shirt or wolfkin fury left them, they were weaker than usual both in strength and in wits. The medieval Icelandic law code Gras, compiled in the 12th century, contains provisions dealing with berserkers and wolf warriors. It describes them as potentially dangerous not just in battle, but in peacetime. The code allows for legal actions against warriors who cannot control their battle rage after returning home. Several sagas mentioned who became problems for their own communities. Men who had channeled violence so effectively in war that they struggled to turn it off during peace. This is psychologically accurate. Modern combat veterans describe similar struggles. The intensity required to survive battle doesn't switch off the moment you return home. The UEFA were effective warriors, yes, but they paid a price, and Norse society, which initially revered them, gradually became wary of them. By the 11th century, as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, attitudes toward the Ewe of Ulfedana shifted. What had been sacred warrior tradition became associated with paganism and barbarism. The church viewed any ritual invoking animal transformation as potentially demonic. Wolf warriors went from honored to suspected. The last historical references to Ulfner appear in the late 11th century. After that silence, the tradition either died out or went so far underground that it left no records. When Christianity finally dominated Scandinavia, the wolf warriors vanished from history. But they left something behind. A tradition preserved in sagas of men who could wear the wolf skin, who could access ferocity beyond normal human limits, who could blur the line between human and beast through will and training rather than supernatural curse. The Greeks gave us the werewolf as punishment. The Norse gave us the werewolf as choice. Both traditions would collide in medieval Europe, creating something darker than either original version. Chapter 3. The medieval transformation. Christianity reshapes the wolf. When Christianity spread across Europe, it brought a new framework for understanding the world. A framework that divided all phenomena into two categories, divine or demonic, approved by God or inspired by Satan. There was no middle ground, no space for set, ambiguous forest gods or sacred warrior traditions or ancient mountain rituals. This binary thinking transformed how Europeans understood the werewolf. Under paganism, shapeshifting could be divine gift, punishment for specific crimes or warrior technique. Under Christianity, it could only be one thing, demonic. Any power that didn't come directly from the Christian God must come from his adversary. If a man became a wolf, either Satan had cursed him or, more commonly believed, he had made a pact with Satan to gain that power. This shift is visible in medieval literature. The Germanic epic poem Beowulf, likely composed sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, includes references to shape-shifters, but treats them ambiguously. The poem doesn't explicitly condemn transformation as demonic, but by the 13th century, when most surviving manuscripts of European folklore were being compiled by Christian monks, werewolves appear almost exclusively as agents of evil. The medieval church faced a theological problem with werewolves. If transformation was physically real, it implied Satan could alter God's creation, human bodies, which challenged divine omnipotence. If transformation was illusion, it implied Satan could deceive human senses so completely that victims believed they were being attacked by wolves when they were actually being attacked by men, which was only slightly less troubling. The solution was a compromise. The influential 13th century scholar, Jez of Tilbury, wrote, "A man does not actually become a wolf. Rather, the devil creates a wolf form and places the man's spirit within it, while his human body lies in a trance." This explanation preserved both divine omnipotence and the reality of werewolf attacks, but theological debate mattered far less than popular belief. And in the villages and towns of medieval Europe, people believed in werewolves with absolute conviction. Why? Because their lives provided constant evidence that seemed to confirm the legend. Consider the medieval European experience. Villages were isolated, separated by forests that were genuinely dangerous. Real wolves hunted those forests. Rabies existed. Ergotism, poisoning from fungus in infected grain, caused hallucinations and violent behavior. Mental illness went undiagnosed and untreated. Serial killers existed, but had no name. When villagers found livestock dead, when children disappeared, when travelers were attacked on forest roads, they needed explanations. The werewolf provided one. It explained attacks that seemed too cunning for normal wolves. It explained why certain people behaved strangely. It explained why some community members seemed isolated, antisocial, different. Most importantly, it gave terror a name and face. Fear is more bearable when you can identify its source. Medieval sermons reinforced these beliefs. Preachers warned that Satan could grant the power of transformation to those who rejected God. They cited biblical passages that seemed to support the concept, though none actually mentioned werewolves specifically. They pointed to the Greek lion myth as proof that even pagans recognized divine punishment through transformation. They created a theological framework that validated and encouraged werewolf beliefs. The medieval werewolf differed from both Greek and Norse versions in crucial ways. It was neither punishment for specific crime nor warrior's chosen path. It was supernatural affliction or diabolic pact. The person either had no control over transformations, cursed against their will, or had actively sought the power through witchcraft and devil worship. This belief system had practical consequences. If werewolves were real, they could be hunted. If transformation came from demonic pact, it was heresy. If it was heresy, it fell under church jurisdiction. And if it fell under church jurisdiction, confession could be extracted through torture and punishment, delivered through execution. All the pieces were in place. All that was needed was the speed, arc that would ignite panic. That spark came in the 16th century when Europe descended into what historians now call the werewolf trials, a period when suspected werewolves were dragged into courtrooms, tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes, and executed in ways designed to send messages about the price of serving Satan. We are about to enter that darkness. But before we do, understand this. The medieval church didn't create the werewolf. The Greeks created the myth, the Norse gave it warrior power, but the church gave it teeth. It weaponized the legend. turned it into a tool for enforcing conformity, for explaining inexplicable violence, for giving communities someone to blame when things went wrong. The werewolf trials were not about wolves. They were about fear, and about what humans do to other humans when fear takes control. Chapter 4. The werewolf trials begin. Gilles, set. Gagny, France, 1573. On September 18, 1573, in the region of Dole in eastern France, several children vanished while gathering wood in the forest. Search parties found nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no clues except rumors of a large wolf seen near the forest edge around the time the children disappeared. Then, in October, a young girl was found dead. Her body showed bite marks that confused the investigators. They resembled wolf bites, but were somehow wrong. The spacing was off. The depth was inconsistent. Some physicians who examined the remains said the wounds could have been made by human teeth. Panic spread through Dole. Parents kept children inside. No one traveled alone. Armed groups patrolled the forest, and suspicion fell on a man named Gilles Gagny. Gagny lived in a decrepit hut deep in the woods far from the village. He was desperately poor. So poor, he and his wife survived on whatever they could gather or trap. He was antisocial, rarely attending church, avoiding contact with other villages. He was stranger-looking, gaunt, and willed from malnutrition and isolation. In prosperous times, such differences would be overlooked, but in times of fear, they become evidence. The attacks continued. On November 8th, a boy's body was discovered. On November 14th, another child vanished. Witnesses reported seeing a figure that looked like a large wolf, but moved wrong, as if its legs bent in ways wolf legs shouldn't. Someone claimed they saw eyes glowing red in the darkness near Gear's hut. These witnesses were probably seeing nothing more than reflection of firelight or imagination fueled by terror. But in the climate of 1573, their testimony was accepted as fact. On November 15th, Gilles Gagny was arrested. The trial records survive. They're held in the archives d'Étonnel Jura in Dole. Multiple historians have analyzed them, and they tell a story that's both clear and horrifying. Gagny was interrogated. Medieval and early modern interrogation meant torture. The goal, wasn't to discover truth. It was to produce confession. And under sufficient pain and terror, anyone will confess to anything if they believe it will make the pain stop. Gagny confessed to everything. He said that a ghost or demon had appeared to him in the forest, teaching him how to transform into a wolf using an ointment. He said he had killed and partially eaten 4 children. He provided details about the attacks, details that matched what investigators wanted to hear. Whether those details matched reality is impossible to determine. The children were dead. Someone had killed them. Whether that someone was Gagny, or whether he was simply the most convenient target for a community's desperate need to identify a culprit, we cannot know. The court convicted him. The sentence, death by burning. On January 18, 1574, Gilles was dragged through the streets of Dole to the town square. He was tied to a stake. Kindling was piled around him, and he was burned alive in front of a crowd that believed they were watching the execution of a werewolf. Before the fire was lit, Gagny reportedly spoke. The trial records claim he begged for mercy, maintaining that he had been possessed against his will. Some witnesses said he seemed confused, as if he didn't understand what was happening. Others said he showed no emotion at all, as if trauma had broken something fundamental in his mind. The fire killed him slowly. Medieval burning wasn't efficient. The goal was often to maximize suffering as spectacle and warning. Gear likely suffocated from smoke before the flames reached his vital organs, but even that took several agonizing minutes. The crowd dispersed, satisfied that justice had been served. The children were still dead, but at least now there was an explanation. There was a monster, and the monster had been destroyed. 3 aspects of the Gagny case are worth noting. First, no physical evidence of werewolf transformation was presented at trial. The prosecution didn't claim they'd found wolf pelts or supernatural ointments. They relied entirely on Gagny's tortured confession and witness testimony about seeing a wolf-like creature. Modern legal standards would consider this inadmissible, but 16th century courts operated under different rules. Second, Gear's extreme poverty is crucial context. He lived in conditions of desperate starvation. The attacks occurred during a particularly harsh winter when food was scarce. Some historians have suggested that Gagny, driven to madness by hunger, may actually have killed and cannibalized the children, not as a werewolf, but as a starving human who had broken society's deepest taboo. The werewolf confession would then be either a delusion brought on by guilt and trauma, or a way to make sense of his own act, ions, or simply what interrogators forced him to say. We cannot know which. Third, the Garnier case established a template that would be followed in hundreds of subsequent trials. The pattern: 1. Children disappear or are found dead. 2. Community panics. 3. Suspicion focuses on an outsider. Someone poor, strange, antisocial. 4. Witnesses report seeing a wolf-like creature. 5. The suspect is tortured until confession is obtained. 6. The suspect is executed, usually by burning. 7. The community believes the threat is ended. This pattern would repeat across France, Germany, Switzerland, and other regions over the next century. The werewolf trials had begun, and once begun, they fed themselves. Each execution validated the belief that werewolves were real. Each belief generated more accusations. Each accusation led to more executions. The cycle would continue until something broke it. That breaking point was still decades away. In the meantime, the fires burned, and men and women who were probably guilty of nothing more than being different died in flames because their communities needed monsters to kill. Chapter 5. Peter Stump, the Werewolf of Bedburg, Germany. Set. 1589. 16 years after Giles Garnier burned in Dole, another trial captured Europe's attention. This one was larger, more sensational, and infinitely stranger. The case of Peter Stump, or Peter Stump, or Peter Stubber, as some sources spell it, the Werewolf of Bedburg. What makes the Stump case different from Gear is this. No official court records survive. None. No trial transcripts, no legal documents, no execution orders. Everything we know comes from a single source. A printed pamphlet published in Germany and later translated into English. A pamphlet designed not to inform but to sell. And what it sold was the most lurid, detailed, impossible werewolf story ever committed to paper. Let me be absolutely clear. Rab out this before we examine the story. The pamphlet that describes Peter Stump's crimes and execution may be propaganda. It may be exaggeration. It may contain kernels of truth wrapped in layers of fabrication. Or it may be complete fiction inspired by actual murders committed by someone, whose name we'll never know. We cannot verify almost anything about this case through independent sources. What we can do is examine what the pamphlet claims and analyze why it became so influential. The pamphlet, titled A True Discourse Declaring the Damnable Life and Death of One Stubby Peter, was published in London in 1590. It claims to translate and summarize a German original. The story it tells is this. Near the town of Bedburg in the electorate of Cologne, a series of brutal murders occurred over a period of approximately 25 years. Livestock were found torn apart. Women disappeared from roads and fields. Children vanished. The attacks were attributed to a large wolf that hunted the area with apparent intelligence and uncanny ability to evade capture. According to the pamphlet, in autumn of 1589, a group of hunters and their dogs finally cornered this wolf near a grove of trees. But when they closed in for the kill, the wolf was gone. In its place stood a man, Peter Stump, a local, farmer of some prosperity. The hunter seized him and brought him before authorities under interrogation, which certainly included torture, though the pamphlet glosses over this detail. Stump allegedly confessed to an astonishing catalogue of crimes. He claimed that 25 years earlier he had made a pact with the devil. In exchange for his soul, Satan gave him a magical belt. When Stump wore this belt, he transformed into a powerful wolf with eyes glowing like fire and great paws with sharp claws. In wolf form, he killed and consumed 14 children, 2 pregnant women, and numerous livestock. He said he preyed the taste of young girls and would tear fetuses from pregnant women's bodies to eat them. The pamphlet then describes even more horrific claims that Stump committed incest with his daughter, that he maintained an affair with a distant relative, that he practiced witchcraft, that he led a secret society of devil worshippers. These accusations follow the standard pattern of early modern witch trial confessions: sexual transgression, family violation, secret societies, devil worship, all the elements that prosecutors expected and torture defendants until they confessed to. The trial was held in Bedburg. Stump was found guilty. The sentence was designed to be the most horrific punishment imaginable, calculated to serve as warning and spectacle. On October 31st, 1589, Halloween, appropriately enough for a case that would inspire centuries of werewolf fiction. Peter Stump was brought to a wooden platform in Bedburg's town square. According to the pamphlet, the execution proceeded in stages. First, his flesh was torn from his bones in 10 places using red-hot pincers. Then, his arms and legs were broken with the wooden handle of an axe to prevent him from rising from the grave as a werewolf. Then, his head was struck off. Then, his body was burned to ash. Finally, a wooden pole was erected on the execution ground. On top of the pole, they placed a wooden wheel, symbol of the breaking he'd endured. Above the wheel they mounted Stump's severed head, and around the pole they placed wooden figures, carved to resemble wolves as permanent warning about the price of making pacts with the devil. That's what the pamphlet says happened. But here's what we can actually verify through independent sources. Almost nothing. The town of Beburg existed. A man named Peter Stump may have lived there in the 1580s. People were definitely executed in that region during that period. The late 16th century was the height of both witch trials and werewolf trials across German territories. Beyond that, we're left with a sensational story that historians cannot corroborate. Modern scholars who have investigated the Stump case intensively, including Stuart Clark in Thinking with Demens and Villemar in multiple papers on werewolf trials, point out numerous red flags. The pamphlet was published in London, not Bedburg. It was written in English, for English readers who couldn't verify the story. London printers in 1590 were producing numerous pamphlets about continental European scandals, many of which were exaggerated or fabricated to satisfy reader demand for shocking content. The pamphlet industry was profit-driven, not truth-driven. The German original that the English pamphlet claims to translate has never been found. Numerous German archives have been searched. Nothing. If this trial was as significant as the pamphlet suggests, involving 25 years of murders, a dramatic capture, and an unprecedented execution, German chronicles of the period should mention it. They don't. The details of the crimes match too perfectly with werewolf folklore. The magical belt that grants transformation is a standard element in German werewolf legends. The appetite for pregnant women and fetuses echoes ancient Greek and Roman stories about Lamia and similar monsters. The devil pacted follows standard witch trial formula. The confession reads, like someone compiled every werewolf trope and every witch trial accusation into one impossible narrative. The execution-specific tortures, the 10 places of flesh removal, the breaking of limbs, the burning, the display are described with a kind of detailed relish that suggests either the writer was present or was inventing details to satisfy readers' appetite for gruesome spectacle. So what actually happened in Bedburg in 1589? We don't know. Possibilities include someone was executed for some crime, possibly murder, possibly witchcraft, and the pamphlet exaggerated the details beyond recognition. Multiple crimes and trials from different times and places were combined into one sensational story. The entire story was invented, inspired perhaps by actual unsolved murders in the region, but transformed into propaganda, possibly anti-Catholic, since the electorate of Cologne was Catholic territory, and the pamphlet was published in Protestant England during a period of intense religious conflict. A real serial killer operated in the region was caught and executed, and the werewolf elements were added to the story to make sense of crimes that seem too terrible to be merely human. The last possibility is worth considering. Serial killers existed long before that term was invented. The behavior patterns that define serial murder, compulsive repetition, victim selection, escalation, are not modern phenomena. If someone in the Bedburg region was killing children and women over many years, the community would desperately need an explanation. Werewolf provided that explanation. The supernatural frame made the horror manageable by suggesting it came from outside normal humanity. But whether Peter Stump was a real serial killer, a scapegoat, or a fictional character, the pamphlet about him had enormous impact. It was reprinted multiple times. It was translated into Dutch and French. It spread across Europe, and it established the template for how popular culture would. Imagine werewolf trials. The Stump pamphlet gave us the magical belt that grants transformation, the devil pact as origin, the werewolf, a serial predator targeting women and children specifically, the dramatic capture in midi transformation, and the spectacular execution designed to prevent posthumous resurrection. Most of these elements dawn to appear in earlier werewolf accounts. They're innovations of this single document, yet they became standard, Hollywood would draw on them 300 years later. Modern werewolf fiction still echoes them. The case also reveals something about how myths evolve. The Leon story took shape over centuries of oral tradition before anyone wrote it down. The Alfedna tradition developed over generations of warrior culture, but the Stump story was manufactured, or at least heavily embellished, by a single document produced for profit in the early modern printing industry. We live in the age of mass media. We worry about fake news, viral misinformation, stories that spread faster than truth. But we didn't invent this problem. In 1590, a pamphlet about a werewolf in Bedburg spread across Europe and shaped popular consciousness for centuries. The technology was simpler. The principle was identical. Print what sells. Truth is secondary. The fires that consumed Peter Stump, if he existed, have long since gone cold. But the story keeps burning, and that's worth remembering as we move forward through more documented trials. Sometimes the legend matters more than the truth. Sometimes the story a culture tells itself reveals more than the facts ever could. Chapter 6. Jean Grenier, the boy who believed he was a wolf, France 163. After the grotesque spectacle of Peter Stump's alleged execution, after the torture chambers and the burning purse, we come to a case that offers something different. Not horror, but tragedy. Not a monster, but a child. The trial of Jean Grenier, 13 years old, who walked into a courtroom in Bordeaux, France, in 1603, and told judges he was a werewolf. The story begins in the countryside of southwestern France, in the region around Sani. It was spring 16003. Several children had been attacked while tending sheep or gathering wood. The attacks were attributed to a large wood. Search parties were organized. Guards were posted. Parents kept children close. Then in April, a girl named Marguerite Poirier reported something strange. She said she'd been watching her flock when a boy approached her, someone she vaguely recognized from the area. He tried to attack her, but she fought him off with a stick. She ran to the nearest farm. When men from the farm returned to the pasture to search, they found only wolf tracks. Margaret's testimony was taken seriously because other children had reported similar encounters. A boy, matching her description, had said. They saw, in the words of one court document, a boy more deserving of pity than punishment, lacking understanding of his own condition. On September 6, 1603, the Parliament of Bordeaux issued its judgment. Jean Grenier was found guilty not of werewolf transformation, but of imbecility and lack of understanding. The court declared that he was mentally incapable of distinguishing reality from delusion. The sentence: John would be committed to a monastery where Franciscan friars would care for him, feed him, educate him if possible, and prevent him from harming himself or others. This was revolutionary. For the first time in a werewolf trial, a court explicitly rejected supernatural transformation and instead recognized mental illness. Jean was taken to a Franciscan monastery near Bordeaux. We know what happened to him there because a man named Pierre d'Ancre, a judge and demonologist, visited him 7 years later in 1610 and wrote about the encounter. D'Ancre described Jean as a small, thin boy with sunken eyes and long nails. He would walk on all fours if not prevented. He refused to look at people directly. He had to be constantly supervised because he tried to eat any raw meat left unattended. The friars reported that Jean could not be educated. He never learned to read or write. He had periods where he seemed calm, but would suddenly become agitated, claiming he needed to hunt, that the Lord of the Forest was calling him. He would try to escape the monastery, to return to the woods. The friars kept him in a secure room for his own safety. Jean Grenier died in the monastery sometime around 1611, approximately age 21. The exact date isn't recorded. A quiet death for a boy whose case transformed how Europe understood werewolf trials. So what was actually wrong with Jean? Modern psychiatrists and psychologists who've studied the case records suggest several possibilities. Clinical lycanthropy, the genuine psychiatric condition where patients believe they're transforming into animals. This condition is documented rare, but real, often associated with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. Severe childhood trauma combined with abandonment leading to dissociative states and fantasy life that became indistinguishable from reality for him. Possible developmental disability or brain damage, perhaps from malnutrition during critical developmental periods or from physical abuse. A combination of all three, trauma, malnutrition, and mental illness, creating a child so damaged that he believed his own delusions completely. One detail stands out. John was obsessed with eating raw meat. The friars had to lock away any uncooked food. This wasn't shape-shifting. This was a starving child who'd spent years living on whatever he could catch or scavenge, developing associations between hunger and meat in ways that never normalized, even when regular food became available. The John Granier case matters for three reasons. First, it demonstrated that skepticism about werewolf trials was possible even in the early 17th century. The Bordeaux judges showed that applying reason and investigation could reveal natural explanations for apparently supernatural phenomena. Second, it established precedent. Other courts would cite the Gier judgment when dealing with similar cases, using it to argue for medical rather than demonic interpretation of werewolf confessions. Third, it shows us what werewolf trials often were beneath the supernatural language: traumatized, mentally ill, or intellectually disabled people, caught in a system that had no framework for understanding their conditions except through demons and curses. Not every accused werewolf was innocent. Some cases involved real violence committed by real people. But Jean Gier was a child who needed help, and in '63, incredibly, he received something closer to treatment than punishment. The skepticism shown in his case would slowly spread. By the end of the 17th century, werewolf trials were declining, not because people stopped believing in werewolves, but because courts were becoming less willing to accept confessions at face value. Before the trials ended completely, though, one more case deserves examination because it flipped every assumption about werewolves upside down. Chapter 7. Peace of Colton Brun. The benevolent werewolf, Livonia, 89 years after Ginger, confessed to being a werewolf in France. A similar confession occurred in the Baltic region of Livonia, in what's now Latvia. But this confession was different in a way that left church authorities completely confused. An 80-year-old man named Tees from the village of Colton Brun stood in front of an ecclesiastical court and calmly announced that he was a werewolf. The judges, expecting the usual pattern of devil pacts and child murder, prepared to condemn him. But they didn't confess to serving the devil. He claimed to serve God. The trial records survive in Swedish archives. Livonia was under Swedish rule at the time. They're remarkable documents because they show church authorities encountering a werewolf belief system completely different from the one they'd been prosecuting for over a century. T.S. explained that he was a werewolf, yes, but not the evil kind. He was one of the hounds of God, along with other werewolves. He claimed there were many. He descended into hell 3 times per year, specifically on the nights of St. Meda. 3 times per year, specifically on the nights of St. Maida, Lucia, December 13th, Pentecost, and St. John, June 24th. In hell, they fought witches and demons who had stolen grain and livestock from local farmers. If the werewolves won these battles, the coming harvest would be good. If they lost, the harvest would fail and people would starve. The judges were stunned. This wasn't the devil pack they expected. This was some kind of folk belief that cast werewolves as defenders, not destroyers. They pushed back. Surely Thesis was confused. Surely he meant that he served the devil. Thesis insisted he served God. The werewolves were God's hunting dogs. They fought evil on behalf of their communities. The court asked, how did he become a werewolf? They said he had been born with the ability. Others were chosen by other werewolves and taught the secrets. There was no devil pact, no satanic ritual, just a gift passed down, a responsibility accepted. The court asked what happened when he transformed. They said his body remained in his bed while his spirit took wolf form. This was significant. It suggested a shamanic tradition, not physical transformation. Many indigenous Northern European beliefs involved spirit journeys where a person's consciousness traveled in animal form while their body remained safely behind. The court asked, could he prove any of this, but told them about specific battles he'd fought, specific sea demons he'd defeated. He gave names of other werewolves, all of whom he said had died protecting their communities from supernatural harm. He spoke with absolute conviction and showed no fear of execution. He genuinely believed that what he'd done was holy work. The judges consulted extensively. This case didn't fit their framework. If T served the devil, why did he claim to fight demons? If he opposed the devil, why did he call himself a werewolf? The theological implications were troubling. Could a werewolf serve God? Could transformation be holy rather than demonic? They couldn't reach consensus. Finally, they compromised. In October 1692, the court found thieves guilty of idolatry and superstitious beliefs. Not witchcraft, not devil worship, just stubbornly holding on to pagan ideas. The sentence was 10 lashes, not burning, not execution, just corporal punishment meant to persuade him to abandon his heresy. There's no record that the punishment changed Thesis's mind. At 80 years old, he'd been a werewolf his entire life. He wasn't going to stop believing because a court disagreed. The case is invaluable to historians, for several reasons. It proves that werewolf beliefs varied significantly by region and culture. The standard narrative of devil packs and child murder was widespread but not universal. In Baltic and Slavic regions, traditions existed where werewolves were protectors, not predators. It shows the collision between indigenous beliefs and Christian orthodoxy. What the described sounds remarkably like shamanic practices found throughout northern Europe and Siberia. Spirit journeys to the underworld, battles with malevolent forces, responsibility for community welfare. Christianity had suppressed these practices for centuries, but in isolated regions they survived into the late 17th century. It demonstrates that by 1692, even church courts were becoming unwilling to execute for werewolf confessions. A century earlier, teas would likely have burned, but the age of werewolf trials was ending. Skepticism was spreading. Courts wanted evidence beyond confession. Thesis hounds of God concept appears in other sources from the Baltic region. Folklore collections from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and parts of Poland reference werewolves who fight witches, defend harvests, or journey to the underworld. These weren't secret traditions. They were openly practiced folk beliefs that communities relied on. This challenges our understanding of what werewolf meant across different cultures. In Catholic France and Germany, werewolf meant devil servant, child killer, human cursed or corrupted. In Baltic Livonia, werewolf meant spirit warrior, demon fighter, community protector. Same word, opposite meanings. The TS case also highlights something important about confession. When John Granier confessed to being a werewolf, he described what interrogators expected to hear: attacks on children, devil pacts, forbidden appetites. When thieves confessed, he described what his culture expected from werewolves: spirit battles, harvest protection, holy service. Both believed their confessions completely. Both were describing internalized cultural narratives, not literal transformations. After this, werewolf trials become increasingly rare in historical records. The last execution for werewolf transformation occurred in France in 1619, when a man was burned for allegedly causing storms while in wolf form. After that, silence. Courts continued prosecuting witchcraft for another century. But werewolf-specific charges largely disappeared. Why did the trials end? Multiple factors. The Enlightenment brought increased skepticism about supernatural transformation. Medical knowledge expanded, offering alternative explanations for behavior once attractual, buttered to lycanthropy. Legal standards changed, requiring physical evidence rather than confession alone. The wolf populations of Europe were declining due to hunting and habitat loss, making wolf attacks less common and wolf-rated fears less immediate. But the belief didn't die. It went underground into folklore, into whispered stories, into rural traditions that urban authorities no longer prosecuted. The werewolf survived not in courtrooms, but in the collective imagination, waiting for one more moment of terror that would bring the legend roaring back into public consciousness. Not in a courtroom this time, but in a countryside terrorized by something that left over 100 bodies in 3 years. The Beast of Givaudan was coming. Chapter 8. The Beast of Givaudan, France. On June 30th, 1764, in the remote province of Jang in south-central France, a young woman named John Bull was attacked while tending cattle near the village of Saint-Lubdas. Something emerged from the forest. Witnesses described it as wolf-like, but larger, with reddish fur and a massive head. It killed Jean quickly. When villagers found her body, it had been partially consumed. This was the first documented victim of what would become the most famous unsolved animal attack case in European history. Over the next 3 years, something hunted the countryside of Joda, killing over 100 people, mostly women and children, and terrorizing a region covering over 200 square miles. The case is exceptionally well documented, unlike earlier werewolf stories that survive mainly through pamphlets and folklore. The Beast of Givaudan left a paper trail, parish records documenting deaths, military reports from hunters sent to stop it, letters between local authorities and the royal court in Paris, newspaper accounts from across France, testimonies from survivors and autopsy reports examining victims' bodies. We know more about this case than any other involving suspected werewolf activity, and what we know raises more questions than it answers. Let me be clear from the start. Nobody seriously believed the beast was a supernatural werewolf. This was 1764, the height of the Enlightenment. Voltaire was writing, Rousseau was publishing. The educated elite of France had long since dismissed werewolf trials as medieval, set. Superstition. When authorities in Gévaudan reported attacks, they didn't talk about curses or transformations. They talked about an animal, a wolf, probably maybe a rabid wolf, or an unusually large wolf, or an unusually large wolf, or a wolf behaving abnormally. But the rural population of John, isolated, deeply Catholic, living in conditions not far removed from medieval peasantry, weren't so sure. Some whispered that this was the beast of the apocalypse sent to punish France for its sins. Others said it was a werewolf, a human transformed by Satan to destroy God's children. Still others believed it was a natural animal, but somehow directed by supernatural intelligence. The authorities ignored these theories and focused on hunting the creature. They failed repeatedly. The attacks followed patterns. The beast hunted primarily in daylight, unusual for wolves. It targeted humans specifically, ignoring livestock even when animals were easier prey. It attacked mostly women and children, avoiding adult men unless they were alone. It seemed to choose victims deliberately, stalking them before attacking, and it was uncannily good at avoiding capture. Survivors described the beast in consistent terms. Larger than a normal wolf with reddish-brown fur, a broad chest, a massive head, and a tail longer than a wolf's tail. Some said it had stripes along its back. Some said its eyes seemed wrong, too forward, facing. Some said it moved, with a loping gait, unlike any wolf they'd seen. After multiple attacks, the local nobility organized hunting parties. They failed to find the beast. The province appealed to the crown. King Louis X, 15th, embarrassed that his kingdom couldn't protect its citizens from an animal, sent professional wolf hunters. The most famous was François Antoine, the king's Zarcoy, royal gun-bearer, leader of the royal wolf hunts. Antoine arrived in February 1765 with soldiers and professional hunters. He spent months tracking the beast. On September 21st, 1765, near the royal abbey of Chazes, Antoine's hunting party cornered a large wolf. They shot it. The wolf, an unusually large male, was killed. Antoine had the body stuffed and sent to Versailles as proof that the beast was dead. The attack stopped for 2 months. No deaths were reported. France celebrated. The king rewarded Antoine. The case seemed closed. Then, on December 2nd, 1765, a girl was killed near the village of Bez. The attacks resumed. Over the next year and a half, dozens more people died. Whatever Antoine had killed, it wasn't the beast. The pattern continued through 1766 and into 1767. More hunting parties failed. More victims died. The beast seemed unkillable. Some said bullets passed through it without effect. Likely a misinterpretation of what happens when panicked shooters miss a moving target. Some said it could only be killed by silver bullets, blessed by a priest, a belief that would later become werewolf canon, but appeared here first, not as folklore, but as, desperate speculation about how to stop an apparently invincible predator. The case was becoming an embarrassment to the crown and a political liability. The king withdrew royal support. Gévaudan was left to solve its own problem. And then, on June 19, 1767, a local hunter named Jean Chassel killed something. The story of that hunt has been embellished over centuries. But here's what we can verify from contemporary documents. Chassel was part of a large hunting party organized by local nobility. They were combing through forest near the village of Suggs when dogs flushed something from the underbrush. Jastel fired. The animal fell. When they examined the body, they found a large cannon wolf-like, but with unusual features. It was male, weighed approximately 140 pounds, had reddish fur with dark stripes, and had a skull larger than the typical wolves. When they opened the animal's stomach, they found human remains. The partially digested remains of a young girl, later identified as one of the most recent victims. The body was preserved and examined by multiple witnesses. Descriptions vary somewhat, but most agree it was definitely not a normal wolf. Theories about what it actually was include an unusually large wolf, a wolf-dog hybrid, a young lion escaped from a management, a hyena that somehow reached France, or a species of large carnivore not known to science. After Chastel's kill, the attack stopped completely. Whatever had been hunting Javon was dead. The final count, between 110 and 124 confirmed deaths, depending on which sources you trust. Dozens more people were attacked, but survived. The attacks lasted 3 years. Multiple professional hunters failed to stop them. The creature was only killed by a local hunter who knew the territory intimately. So, what was the beast of Javang? We still don't know. The body was examined by multiple people, but no naturalist ever conducted a formal scientific analysis. It was put on display locally, then disappeared, probably set, decomposed, or was destroyed. No skeleton was preserved. We have only descriptions which are contradictory and filtered through non-expert observers. Modern theories include a large wolf, possibly with unusual coloring due to genetic mutation. Wolves in Europe typically weighed 60 to 90 pounds. A 140-pound wolf would be exceptional but not impossible. Behavior of targeting humans primarily is unusual, but documented in cases where wolves become habituated to human presence and learn to view humans as prey. A wolf-dog hybrid. This is currently the most popular theory among zoologologists. Wolves occasionally breed with large dogs, producing hybrids with unpredictable characteristics. A hybrid might have unusual coloring, larger size than pure wolves, and potentially less fear of humans if it had domestic dog ancestry. The stripes witnesses described could be brindling patterns common in some dog breeds, an escaped exotic animal. 18th century French nobility sometimes kept exotic animals in set. Private menageries. A young lion, a striped hyena, or another large carnivore could have escaped and survived in the wilderness. This would explain the unusual appearance and behavior. However, no records exist of any management in the region reporting an escaped animal. Multiple animals. Some historians suggest that several different animals were responsible for the attacks, explaining why killing one animal in 1765 didn't stop the deaths. The beast might have been a label applied to any large predator in the region during those years' deliberate human training. This is the darkest theory. Some historians, most notably John Jack Balwys in his book, Lafel Dean Jack Balwys in his book, Leo D. Nebo suggest that someone trained one or more large dogs to attack humans, then release them into the countryside. This would explain why the beast seemed to specifically target vulnerable humans rather than livestock. It would explain the unusual appearance. A trained attack dog might have been a wolf, set, hound or mastiff breed, and it would explain why the attacks were back. They're so difficult to stop. The animal wasn't hunting for food, but following training. This theory remains speculation, but it can't be entirely dismissed. The truth is, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that the beast of Givaudan wasn't a werewolf. It was flesh and blood. It died when shot. It had a stomach full of human remains because it had eaten those victims, not because of supernatural curse. But the case matters to werewolf history for 3 reasons. First, it shows how communities respond when confronted with inexplicable violence. The same patterns that created medieval werewolf trials appeared in Gervadine. Deaths of vulnerable community members, inability to identify the threat, rising panic, desperate search for explanations, supernatural theories emerging when natural explanations fail. The difference was that 18th century authorities rejected the supernatural explanations and kept searching for natural ones. Second, it influenced popular culture deeply. The Beast of Givaudan became one of the most famous mysteries in French history. It inspired countless fictional works, and it contributed specific elements to werewolf legend, most notably the silver bullet myth, which originated here not as ancient folklore, but as speculation about how to kill the apparently unkillable beast. Third, it demonstrates that sometimes real dangers are more terrifying than imaginary ones. A genuine animal or animals killed over 100 people across 3 years. Entire regions lived in fear. Children stopped going outside. Women couldn't work in fields. Economic activity collapsed in affected areas. This wasn't folklore creating fear. This wasn't folklore creating folklore as a way to process real, ongoing trauma. The Beast of Jordan was the last time a presumed werewolf case attracted national attention in European history. After this, werewolf stories moved permanently into the real, Maya folklore and fiction. Real wolves still kill people occasionally. They're predators, and predators sometimes prey on humans, but never again would such attacks be interpreted through the framework of transformation and curse. The age of werewolf trials had ended. The age of werewolf understanding was beginning. Chapter 9. Clinical lycanthropy. When patients believed they're wolves, while the beast of Givaudan was being hunted in France, something was happening elsewhere in Europe that would permanently change how we understand werewolf beliefs. Doctors were beginning to study patients who claimed to be animals, and they were documenting what they found. The term lycanthropy has been used since ancient Greece. It comes from loios, wolf, and anthropos, human. But for most of history, it referred to supernatural transformation. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it began to mean something else, a specific type of mental illness characterized by the delusion that one is transforming into an set animal, most commonly a wolf. This is clinical latherism. It's real, it's documented, and understanding it helps explain many historical werewolf cases. One of the earliest medical descriptions comes from Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, published in 1621. Burton wrote, "Lycanthropy is a disease, not a transformation. Patients believe themselves to be wolves and behave accordingly. But this is melancholy madness, not supernatural change." Burton was ahead of his time. Most 17th century physicians still believed supernatural transformation was possible. But by the 18th century, medical opinion was shifting. The Enlightenment brought new frameworks for understanding mental illness. What earlier generations called demon possession, later generations called madness, lunacy, or melancholy. Victorian-era physicians refined these diagnoses further. They distinguished between different types of delusions. They tried to identify causes, and they began documenting case studies of patients with animal transformation delusions. Several particularly well-documented cases appear in Victorian medical journals. In 1847, British physician Dr. John Connolly published a paper in the Journal of Mental Science describing a patient at Hanwell Asylum in London. The patient, a man in his 30s, believed he transformed into a wolf at night. He would crawl on all fours, refuse clothing, attempt to bite staff, and howl. Dr. Connolly noted that the patient was otherwise rational. He could discuss mathematics, politics, literature, but on the subject of his transformation, he was absolutely convinced of its reality. Treatment with opiates and hydrotherapy showed limited effect. In 1854, French psychiatrist Dr. Jean Escarot, one of the founders of modern psychiatry, documented multiple cases of lycanthropy at Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. His most detailed case study involves a woman who believed she transformed into a wolf during menstruation. She described feeling her teeth sharpen, her hands curl into claws, and her skin grow fur. She could see her transformation in the mirror, though nurses confirmed no physical change occurred. Escarol theorized that the delusion was connected to hysteria, a now discredited diagnosis. But his documentation of the patient's subjective experience remains valuable. In 1863, German physician Dr. Richard von Kraft, Debing later famous for psychopathia sexualis, described a patient in Vienna who believed himself to be various animals at different times: wolf, bear, eagle, snake. The transformations were triggered by stress or perceived threats. During episodes, the patient moved and vocalized, like the animal he believed himself to be. Von Kraft-Ebing classified this as a form of paranoia with transformation delusions. These Victorian case studies share calm man elements. The patients genuinely believed they transformed. This wasn't performance or attention-seeking. Their subjective experience was real to them, regardless of objective reality. Physical sensation accompanied the delusion. Patients described feeling their bodies change, bones shifting, teeth growing, fur sprouting. These sensations, though not producing actual physical changes, felt completely real. The delusion was often specific and consistent. A patient who believed himself a wolf didn't suddenly believe himself a bear. The animal identity remained stable, suggesting the delusion had psychological significance to the individual. The transformation belief often connected to times of stress, loss of control, or intense emotion. Many patients reported transforming when angry, frightened, or sexually aroused, times when the boundary between civilized behavior and primal instinct felt most fragile. So, what causes clinical lycanthropy? Modern psychiatry recognizes it as a rare symptom that can appear in several different underlying conditions. Schizophrenia, the most common association. Lycanthropy can be one of many delusions experienced by schizophrenic patients. It's particularly associated with paranoid schizophrenic, where delusions about one's identity and threats from others are prominent. Bipolar disorder with psychotic features. During manic or severely depressive episodes, some bipolar patients experience delusions that can include transformation beliefs. Severe depression with psychotic features. When depression reaches psychotic levels, delusions can develop. Animal transformation delusions may emerge as a way the mind processes feelings of worthlessness or loss of humanity. Dissociative disorders. In cases of severe trauma, dissociation can involve feeling that one's body or identity has changed. Animal transformation delusions might represent a dissociative state where the patient's sense of human identity fragments, substance-induced psychosis. Some hallucinogenic drugs, particularly those affecting serotonin systems, can trigger transformation delusions. These typically resolve when the drug leaves the system, but in vulnerable individuals might trigger longer-lasting psychiatric problems. Brain injury or neurological disease, damage to specific brain regions, particularly those involved in body image and identity, can produce bizarre delusions, including transformation beliefs. Modern case studies continue to be published. A survey of psychiatry literature from 1975 to 2020 identified 43 documented cases of clinical lycanthropy. The patients were from multiple countries: United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Brazil, India, Lebanon, and Turkey. This confirms that leanness delusions aren't limited to European culture. They appear wherever the concept of shapeshifting exists in folklore. Treatment approaches vary by underlying condition. For schizophrenia-related lycanthropy, antipsychotic medications are primary treatment. These don't always eliminate the delusion entirely, but often reduce its intensity and the distress it causes. For depression or bipolar-related cases, mood stabilizers and antidepressants can help. For trauma-related dissociative cases, psychotherapy targeting the underlying trauma is most effective. Understanding clinical lycanthropy helps us reinterpret a historical case. John Gier, the 13-year-old boy from 1603, probably suffered from clinical lycanthropy. His consistent belief that he transformed, his detailed descriptions of how transformation felt, his inability to distinguish his delusion from reality, all match modern case presentations. T.S. of Colton Brunn, the 80-year-old who claimed to fight demons as a werewolf, might have experienced dissociative states, where he genuinely believed his spirit traveled in wolf form. Whether this was psychiatric illness or shamanic practice becomes a complex question when the line between cultural belief system and individual pathology blurs. Some of the medieval trial victims who confessed to werewolf transformation before torture might have already believed themselves to be werewolves. If they had clinical lycanthropy, they would have confessed to something they genuinely believed was true, making the confession easier to extract and seemingly more credible to investigators. But here's a crucial distinction. Clinical lycanthropy is extremely rare. Modern estimates suggest fewer than 1 in 10 million people experience it. Even in Victorian asylums that house thousands of patients, documented cases number in the dozens across decades. This rarity is important because it means that most historical werewolf accusations couldn't have involved actual lycanthropy. The numbers don't work. If hundreds of people were tried as werewolves across European history and lycanthropy affects 1 in 10 million, then the vast majority of werewolf trials involved people who didn't believe themselves to be wolves at all. They were simply tortured until they said what interrogators wanted to hear. The existence of clinical lycanthropy doesn't explain the trials. It explains a tiny fraction of cases. The trials themselves were driven by cultural beliefs, social panic, and judicial processes that required confessions, regardless of truth. However, understanding that lycanthropy can be a genuine medical condition helps us approach the subject with appropriate nuance. We can say some people throughout history genuinely believe they transformed into wolves, and that belief was a symptom of mental illness, not evidence of supernatural transformation. And most people accused of being werewolves were neither mentally ill nor guilty any crime, but were victims of a judicial system that created its own evidence through torture. Both things are true. Both matter. Modern treatment of patients with lycanthropy delusions emphasizes dignity and respect. Victorian asylums often treated such patients as curiosities or as hopelessly insane. Modern psychiatry recognizes that with appropriate medication and therapy, Many patients can manage or overcome their delusions. They're not monsters. They're not set. Even werewolves in any meaningful sense. They're people experiencing a rare psychiatric symptom that happens to echo an ancient myth. The fact that the symptom exists at all, that human brains can generate the specific delusion of animal transformation, tells us something about our psychology. We contain the concept of becoming animal because we've always recognized the boundary between human and beast as fragile, maintained by behavior rather than essence. Clinical lycanthropy is a medical condition. Yes, but it's a medical condition that could only develop in species that had already invented the myth. The werewolf created the delusion, not the other way around. Chapter 10. Victorian Medical Understanding. Britain's contribution. While continental Europe was documenting clinical lycanthropy and asylums, Britain was making its own contributions to understanding werewolf beliefs, not through trials. Britain had virtually no werewolf trials in its history, but through medical research, folklore collection, and colonial encounters with shapeshifter traditions around the world. The absence of werewolf trials in British history is itself significant and requires explanation. England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland all had wolf populations into the medieval period. Wolves were hunted to extinction in England by approximately 1470, in Scotland by the late 17th century, and in Ireland by the late 18th century. So wolves were present during the period when continental Europe was conducting werewolf trials. Yet Britain tried virtually no one for werewolf transformation. Several factors explain this. British witchcraft laws focused on different crimes than continental laws. The English Witchcraft Act of 1542 and subsequent acts criminalized malipium, harmful magic, but didn't specifically mention transformation. Continental inquisitions treated transformation as evidence of devil worship. English common law treated harmful acts as the crime, not supernatural abilities. British folklore about shapeshifters was limited compared to continental traditions. England had stories of cursed individuals becoming animals, but they were rare and not central to folk belief the way they were in France, Germany, or Eastern Europe. British legal culture required physical evidence. Continental inquisitorial systems allowed conviction based on confession alone, which could be extracted through torture. English common law, while far from perfect, required corroborating evidence. A confession to being a werewolf wouldn't be enough without physical proof or witnesses to actual crimes. The absence of werewolf panic in Britain meant British scholars could study werewolf beliefs somewhat objectively as foreign curiosities rather than immediate threats. Victorian Britain made several important contributions to werewolf understanding. The Folklore Society, founded in London in 1878, sent collectors throughout Britain and corresponded with collectors across Europe and the British Empire. They documented regional shapeshifter beliefs, Scottish tales of seal people, Selkies, Irish stories of people cursed to become animals, Welsh legends from the Maino involving transformation, and English fragments of wolfman tales. The Society's journal published comparative analyses. Scholars noted that shapeshifter legend appeared in virtually every culture, but the specific animal and the cultural meaning varied. Europeans feared wolfmen, West African cultures feared were leopards. South Asian cultures had tigers. Indigenous American tribes had various were-animals depending on local fauna. The pattern was universal, the details were local. Victorian medical journals published extensive documentation of asylum patients with transformation delusions. British Islands were among the most progressive of the era, which isn't saying much by modern standards, but they did keep detailed case records and attempt systematic study rather than simply locking patients away. The Journal of Mental Science, the major British psychiatric publication, contains dozens of case reports from 1850 through 1950 through 1900 involving patients with animal identity delusions. Not all were lycanthropy. Some believed themselves to be dogs, cats, birds, or other creatures. The journal articles attempted to classify these delusions, identify patterns, and develop treatments. One notable contribution came from Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Victorian Britain's most influential psychiatrists. In his 1879 book, The Pathology of Mind, Maudsley argued that transformation delusions represented a psychological regression. He theorized incorrectly, but influentially at the time, that the human mind contained evolutionary layers. Under stress or illness, the mind could regress to earlier evolutionary stages, producing anomic thoughts and behaviors. A patient who believed himself a wolf was experiencing a pathological regression to a pre-realized mental state. Morsley's theory was set. Essentially, Victorian evolution applied to psychology. It's now discredited. Evolution doesn't work that way, and the human mind doesn't contain earlier animal stages. But his work influenced psychiatric thinking for decades and represented serious atatam. PT, to provide natural explanation for transformation beliefs. Victorian anthropology, emerging as a discipline in the mid-9th century, documented shapeshifter beliefs in cultures across the British Empire. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and anthropologists sent reports back to Britain describing rituals, beliefs, and social functions of shapeshifter traditions. These reports, while colored by Victorian biases and colonial attitudes, preserved information about non-European shapeshifter traditions that might otherwise have been lost. They revealed that transformation beliefs served various social functions, marking transitions between childhood and adulthood, explaining antisocial behavior, enforcing community norms, processing trauma, or maintaining shamanic traditions. Sir James Fraser's massive work, The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, devoted extensive sections to worldwide transformation beliefs. Fraser collected accounts from dozens of cultures, showing that shapeshifting wasn't peculiar to Europe, but appeared globally. His comparative method, though now criticized for assuming all cultures evolved through similar stages, helped establish that transformation beliefs were fundamental to human culture. Victorian literature both preserved and transformed werewolf traditions. Authors like Robert Louis Stevenson, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, 1886, and Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891, used transformation metaphors to explore the duality of human nature. While these weren't literally werewolf stories, they explored the same theme, respectable human containing hidden beast. Gothic fiction of the era occasionally featured actual werewolves. Frederick Marryat's The White Wolf of The Harz Mountains, 1839. George W. M. Reynolds' Is Wagner the Werewolf, 1847, and Clemens Hausmann's The Werewolf, 1896 brought werewolf stories to Brit readers, preserving European traditions while adapting them for Victorian sensibilities. These literary works did something important. They separated werewolf stories from belief in actual werewolves. By the late Victorian era, educated British readers understood that werewolf tales were fiction, not history. They were stories that revealed truths about human psychology, not accounts of real transformations. This shift from werewolf as threat to werewolf as metaphor was a crucial step toward modern understanding. Victorian medicine also documented physical conditions that might have contributed to werewolf beliefs. Congenital hypertrichosis, also called werewolf syndrome, causes excessive hair growth over the entire body, including FR. Several Victorian case studies documented individuals with this condition. The most famous was a Burmese man, named M. exhibited in London in the 1880s. Victorian physicians understood hypertrichosis was a medical condition, not supernatural curse, but acknowledged that in earlier eras, people with this condition might have been accused of being werewolves. Rabies was thoroughly studied by Victorian researchers, particularly by Louis Pasteur in France. British medical journals reported on Pasteur's work. Rabies was recognized as transmissible disease that could cause symptoms superficially resembling werewolf legends. Aggression, hydrophobia, fear of water, which could be misinterpreted as aversion to holy water, altered vocalization, and in final stages, confusion and death. Victorian doctors theorized that rabies epidemics might have contributed to historical werewolf panics. Porphyria, a group of